Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's ASAP seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Aviv, a PhD student in CMU, advised by Eric Xin and Albert Gu. Aviv's research centers on efficient sequence modeling and understanding the mechanisms behind language model behavior, with a recent focus on bridging the gap between transformers and the state space models. And today he'll be presenting on the transformers SSM gap and the role of the gather and aggregate mechanism. With that, I'll hand it over to Aviv. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Songlin. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, I'll get started. So, as Songlin mentioned, we're gonna talk about the transformer and SSM performance gap. And specifically, we're gonna look at it through the lens of a mechanism we term gather-and-aggregate. So, to set a common ground, let's first discuss the basics, or what is missing right now. So there is a performance gap between transformers and state space models, right? And I'm sure most of you who were training or dealing with SSMs saw that it somehow somewhat lags behind transformers in mathematical reasoning, in coding, and other similar benchmarks. And in the zoology paper, I think about 2 years ago, this gap between the two models has been linked to the ability to do in-context retrieval, right? So what's in-context retrieval? It's basically when a model goes back within its context and fetches or grabs some previous token or previous chunk of the context into the present token. Now, one example for that would be just the plain dictionary KV retrieval example, right? We have a bunch of key value pairs, and after that, we want to query the model, sorry. And for example, we ask what's scallops, so what's the key corresponding to scallops, and attention usually very easily just return 84, right? Which is the correct answer. And the reason is that SSMs, they have these, every head has this entire context, right? They just cache all the history they've seen, right? But SSMs, so the attentions cache the history they've seen, but SSMs don't have this privilege. They basically have a single fixed size state, and they have to condense everything into this state, right? So what happens is that for a sufficiently big dictionary, right, SSM would just don't have the capacity. They wouldn't have the capacity to actually remember the dictionary, right? So they'll be clueless, right? And having said that, the outline of the talk would be 3 main points that I want to convey from our recent paper. And at the end, we'll actually talk about one additional future paper we're having, but let's wait for that. So the first point is that retrieval in both transformers and SSMs is performed similarly, and it is concentrated in just a few heads, right? So basically, just a few heads out of these hundreds heads or even thousands heads in bigger models, right, are actually the one carrying this property of in-context retrieval, right? And if we take it with what we saw previously about in the zoology paper, right, about the fact that the gap between the models is that the performance gap between the models is due to retrieval abilities, we can deduce that the entire transformer SSM performance gap would stem only from these specific heads that carry the in-context retrieval property, right? So it comes from the granularity of an entire model to the granularity of specific heads that do need to implement this retrieval mechanism, right? And the second point we'll see is that while both implement the same sort of mechanism, SSMs have somewhat like smoother or an approximate version of what attention is actually doing. Okay, so basically we'll see that inherently SSMs cannot actually do or perform this operation as good as attention, not only intuitively, but also mechanistically. And lastly, the last point I'd want to convey is how hybrid models, again, not only intuitively, but also mechanistically, how they close this gap and basically bridge the two models. Okay. So to start discussing that, we'll start with MMLU as a case study. Okay, so basically, I'm sure you're all aware of MMLU and how the benchmark looks like. So I'll have it briefly. So MMLU basically requires extensive knowledge across 57 different fields: law, computer science, medicine, you name it. And a recent paper have seen that SSMs have the knowledge comparable to transformers, but they still lag behind specifically on MMLU. It takes more time for an SSM-based model to match the transformer level performance on MMLU, even though they have the same base knowledge, right? And they did see that this gap between the two models on MMLU stems from the format of MMLU, right? So what's the format? In the classic format, right, the ones that usually SSMs are on par with transformers, you just need to complete the answer, right? So it basically, the task is we append the 4 possible answers and we score the entire prompt and see whether the model could detect which answer is correct. But the MMLU format, which makes harder for SSMs to succeed, is basically, now we don't expect the model to fetch or to put the correct answer, but we expect it to fetch the layer that corresponds to the correct answer, right? So for example, here, if access point is the correct answer, we'd expect it to some sort of map these key values and bring me the key, right? So it somewhat resembles KV retrieval, not exactly, but it has this property of fetching something from context. Okay, and interestingly, as we will see in a few slides, the MMLU format actually activates a mechanism within the network that the classic format doesn't. So to reveal this format, to actually take a step in there, we'll do a gradual pruning experiment. Okay, so what we've done here, we took the entire model and we started pruning layers from the top of it. Very simple. And after every prune, we measured knowledge. And what's knowledge? It's a vague term. So we had to concretely materialize it. And we measure it as a bunch of very classic, very well-known tasks or benchmarks that we have seen, and we have a subsection on it on the paper. We've seen that these benchmarks have minimal reliance on retrieval or context manipulation. They're just almost purely trying to test the data or the knowledge the model possesses, right? And as we prune the layers, what we see that the knowledge is extracted distributively across model, right? So somewhat until the middle of the network, every time we chunk, it diminishes linearly, right? But the case for MMLU is completely different. What we see for MMLU is that its score is practically stays the same, only to a specific layer we prune, which drops to near random, right? So 25%-ish is basically random for multiple choice questions. We have 4 different answers, right? And we wanted to see what happened, what mechanism we deactivated when we pruned the 17th layer, right? So we again took this experiment, took the 0 to 17 layers, as we can see here, And we've done these pruning experiments with a slight change. Now, instead of gradually pruning, we individually took out a layer, measured knowledge and MMLU, put it back, took out a different layer, measured knowledge and MMLU, and put it back. So what we did see is that if you could detect on this graph, there's miscorrelation between how MLU plummets and how knowledge is only in the 16th and 17th layer, right? So for example, 0 and 1, when we remove these layers, we see that both knowledge and MLU plummets down, right? Which means that we might have, I don't know, taken off some basic feature extraction property of the model, and it could not perform either, right? But only in these two layers, knowledge stays high, MLU goes down. And this pattern, not only in the transformer model, but also in Mamba 1-based models, for example, that's Falcon, right? We see this linear diminish while SSM stays high. And again, also here, the two layers that have miscorrelation are only these two, when we saw this drop. Similarly, in Mamba 2-based model, that's Lambda, a model we've trained in our group, right? Again, knowledge goes down, MLU stays high until a specific place, right, where it doesn't correlate. Okay, yeah. So what's exactly happening in these two layers, right? What mechanism have we disabled? What have we done? So we took it one step deeper and probed into 16 and 17 layer, right? And we started brute forcing on these heads of the 16 and 17 layers, and we chopped off all heads that basically didn't affect the MMLU score. And what we came to the point is, that we had one head in the 16th layer, right, which is the 22nd head, and one head at the 17th layer, which is the 24th head, that keeping these two heads, I'm sorry, right, kept MMLU score virtually the same as state of the art. I think the original model is 67, so it basically stayed the same. But only when we took either of the heads, either 24 or 22, MMLU again plummets, right? And it's not that we 24th or 22nd had this very important piece of knowledge. Knowledge benchmark stay the same, right? No major change. Okay, so something within these two heads synergize, right, to score high in MMLU. Yeah, as I mentioned, just taking each of them basically reduces the score to random levels, right? That's multiple choice question. For answers, 25% is random. So what's so important about these two heads, right? What have we revealed? So taking them and doing a different test now is when you take a KV retrieval task, the one we saw previously, and with the more pairs, right, we basically present it and we evaluate the model as the number of pairs grows, as the complexity of the dictionary grows. We can see the following pattern. Disabling the 22nd head on the 16 layer, right, slightly drops the accuracy, right? And every random, if we'll take most of, I think 95% of the heads, if you chop them off, they would not affect the retrieval score, right? So it's something particular to this head. So if we take it out, we see a decline in the retrieval score. Now, if you put it back, the 22nd head, and you take the 24th head, you see an even steeper decline, one that actually aggravates, right? The more pairs we have, the complexity of the dictionary grows. And we'll actually see why there's a difference between the two, why one hurts more than the other, but we'll touch it later on, okay? So basically, what we can deduce is that these two heads are part of a retrieval mechanism, right? So going back, MMLU was actually dependent here on a retrieval mechanism, right? Rather than some other piece of knowledge, right? And once we amputated this retrieval mechanism, it deactivated it, and MMLU could no longer operate, right? So we surgically amputated it. Now, what other, I think, interesting fact, which might be some sort of like unrelated to this topic, a bit off topic, is that MMLU actually is more about retrieval than knowledge, right? So knowledge wasn't changed. And not only that it didn't change, knowledge is rather low here. That's a pruned model, only the first 15 layers and a few heads. And all the big chunk of the model that actually we saw that stores the data, it stores the knowledge, right, is not here. So I think the original model has like a score of 80 or 70 with knowledge. So what it means here is that you can score very well on MMLU with a very little knowledge, right? Could be due to, I don't know, maybe data contamination or modern day language models, might be, I'm not sure. But I think it's kind of interesting that basically MMLU measures retrieval more than it measures knowledge. Yeah. Now, recapping it, we've completed the first point, right? So we saw that retrieval in both transformers and SSMs is performed similarly and is concentrated in just a few heads, right? And as I said, putting it with the zoology result, we know that Transformer-SSM performance gap just stems from these specific heads that implement retrieval, which further affects the entire performance of the models. Okay, great. So how do these two heads operate? What lies underneath them? So we found that they implement sort of synergistic mechanism we term gather-and-aggregate. So I'll introduce this mechanism now. And as you may have guessed, it is composed of two heads. The first head is the gather head. It corresponds to the 22nd head on the 16th layer, where I'll show this example on KV retrieval, and then we'll also show it on other tasks. But broadly speaking, how this gather head operates is that it detects its logical units within the task, within the context. And what it does, it locks onto some boundary token, let's say the new line, and it condenses the entire logical answer or the entire logical unit into this last token, right? So after the gather head, it basically into the residual stream, it propagated these summarizations, right, of each of the pairs. And then later on the network and subsequent layers, what we saw on the 24th head at layer 17 comes the aggregate head. The aggregate head basically looks at these summarizations. Specifically here, green means higher score than the purple. And then he does some sort of a linear combination of them after it scored them, and it could deduce the correct answer, right? And similarly, works virtually the same in MMLU, right? The logical units are the possible answers, right? And what happens is that the model condenses every answer to that new line, to the representative token, which later on the aggregate fetches them, scores them. For example, you can see here that it scores the highest, the one that corresponds to the answer B, right? And then it knows to say B is the answer. And specifically on MMLU, it was seen before by Librem, I think also like 3 years ago, in his paper where he showed that there are two types of heads. One he called the gather head, or sorry, the content gatherer head, which we basically borrowed his name to be the gather head. But the second head he found is the one that actually chooses the answer. They called it in their paper the correct letter head. And we sort of revised this name to the broader retrieval paradigm, because back then they saw it only for transformers and only for the case of when you choose the correct letter in MMLU, right? So we frame it bigger as a retrieval mechanism. right? And indeed, it goes beyond KV retrieval and beyond MMLU. And we can see that it actually activated implicitly in so many tasks and these tasks are where we actually see practically, empirically, that SSMs lag behind Transformer, right? So what we've done here, we iteratively ablated each head. So we went to the transformer, zeroed out different heads. And every time we zeroed out a head, we measured the KV retrieval score of the entire model. Then we reinserted the head and rank by the score its importance, right? So basically, what we've done here is we gave a score to each attention head based on how important it is to retrieval, okay? And then in this table, we basically removed the top gather and aggregate heads, the ones that impairs retrieval the most. And we can see that while knowledge, again, hurts slightly, we lost some knowledge, the retrieval ability, right, and how it affects other tasks is way more crucial, right? So in MMLU, we see a decline of 50%, right, or 43% in the bigger model, right? Or mathematical reasoning, a decline of 80%, 70 to 80%, right? So all across the board, we see that these retrieval-heavy benchmarks basically plummets while knowledge stays roughly the same, right? So we lost this mechanism. We disabled this mechanism to retrieve stuff, and it affected many benchmarks. And what's also interesting is that as we sign MMLU, this mechanism is also implicitly triggered by the task format, right? So what we've done here is we took our challenge and we had it with two formats, one with chat and one with the regular completion mode, right? So chat requires more reasoning. So it has some thinking tokens, which makes the score rise higher. But when we start and remove these gather and aggregate heads, it basically equalizes and start getting even, right, with a regular act challenge score, right? Because basically it loses its ability to do this retrieving, right? It loses its ability to do the thinking and to manipulate the token in the context, and it reduces down to just purely knowledge next token prediction, right? So it affects many benchmarks, and also it depends on format. And bearing this in mind, we now have sort of a more mechanistic view of attention-based retrieval, right? So intuitively, what we knew by till now is that attention retrieves well by caching history, right? But mechanistically looking at that, is that this history caching, right, enables the attention map to be very sharp, to be very noise-free, right? Which actually, in these specific heads, give it the leverage, give it the ability to do very good retrieval. So saying it again, or in different words, this KV cache manifests itself as this attention map, right? And this sharp transition basically are the result of caching the entire history. And the second thing that we saw is that not all heads need to retrieve, right? Only a few key heads do this retrieval behavior. They carry the big machinery, right? And these heads are critical across many tasks. Now, having said that, we looked into the gather-and-aggregate mechanism of transformers, but what about SSMs? Because we did see that they implement this mechanism. They implement this synergetic two-head mechanism, right? So looking at the SSM heads, we see that they somewhat resemble visually the attention variant, sorry, right? So for example, here, that's the gather heads. We can see that someone looks the same, but slightly more smooth, right? Or here, you can see here way more the smoothing. That's the aggregate head, where the cache lets the attention map be very sharp, but here the SSM have it very smooth, right? So we know again that they interact by this graph, but how do we know that they actually implement gather and aggregate, right? They look similar, but how do they know they implement it? So we've done a simple experiment, and we took every gather and aggregate, specifically here is the gather heads of the SSMs, right? And we molded onto it the pattern we saw in the attention maps, right? So after that, we took, for example, this head, and we molded it to that pattern, right? Or for the aggregate head, we took this very noisy version of the aggregate head, we molded the pattern we know that aggregate heads need, and we had resulted with this, with that head, right? And basically, if you recall from the first experiment, nullifying these two heads completely, zeroing them out, resulted in a random score, right? But if we use this mask, the MMLU score did not change at all, right? So basically, what we showed here, that this mechanism, even though very noisy for SSM, only needs the information that flows out of here, right? And only needs the information that propagates from here, right? So we conclude here that SSMs also develop this gather and aggregate mechanism, right? But in a slightly noisier version. And taking a similar point of view as we've done to attention, we can see that SSMs have this hidden state that compresses history into this evolving representation, which intuitively means it cannot do retrieval. But mechanistically, this state, single state, manifests itself as a very noisy version of these heads, right? And it adds noise, which reduces the power of the gather and aggregate mechanism, right? So this is somewhat the mechanistic explanation for why SSMs lag behind transformers in that sense, right? And it has implications. So the fact that SSMs implement a smoother version, a weaker version, has implications. So for example, here, what we did is we took a transformer and an SSM, and we, again, as before, started taking out gather and aggregate heads, right? And what we see is that SSMs are less sensitive to this ablation, right? So for example, MMLU went down 50% in transformer, but only 20% in SSMs, or SWDE at a benchmark that basically manipulate HTML files, if I recall correctly, and yeah, do this all sort of in-context manipulation. And it also went down by 35% in transformer, but only about 15% in SSMs, right? So we see this slower decline, and SSMs are less sensitive, right? And this less sensitivity is actually a result of their weaker form of gather and aggregate, right? Because they have this weaker implementation, they need to compensate for the weaker implementation, right? So they have redundancy, they multiply themselves. They have more instances. SSMs have more instances of this gather and aggregate mechanism in order to compensate for the inability of a single head or a single state to remember it all, right? They have more instances of these remembering heads, right? So this is one of the implication of this struggle of gather and aggregate. And another implication that SSMs show is that they actually have harder time, or that's basically a different point of view to look at the same underlying cause, is that they have a harder time matching the transformer attention, right? So what do I mean? So in this experiment, we took a transformer layer, right? Basically stacked of attentions, and we have done a layer-to-layer distillation. So we took an SSM layer and we tried to match the input and output of every of the attention layers, and it resulted in a new SSM model right? That every layer is independently aligned with this corresponding attention. Now, what we can see is that when we take this model, right, and we measure its MMLU, we see that the score is 33. Let's call it a baseline, right? So measuring this individually distilled layer MMLU as a whole, right, no end-to-end alignment, it scored 33. And then what we've done is we took a single attention layer and replaced it instead of the first, for example, SSM layer. And then we evaluated, right? We evaluated the MMLU score of this semi-hybrid, right? And put it here in this graph. Then we turned this layer again to SSM and we took the second layer, right? Sorry, we took the second layer. Again, we switched it with an SSM and measured this hybrid performance on MMLU. And what we saw is only when we got to the layer, to the 17th layer, MMLU jumped to 50, right? And if you recall, what we saw previously is that in layer 17, there's an aggregate head, right? So basically, what we see here, that the SSM variant, the individually distilled heads, could match in terms of knowledge extraction or language modeling the attention heads, but only, right, when it came to the aggregation layer where there's an aggregate head, it had harder time mimicking the distribution of this layer, right? And only when we put back the attention layer, we see MMLU jump to 50. And measuring this model or this model both had the same knowledge, right? It's not that anything has changed. We didn't add new knowledge into the system. It's only we put the existing knowledge, we gave this SSM model basically the ability to do retrieval better, right? So only by giving it the ability to do retrieval, MMLU jumped, right? So by now, we also saw that SSMs do this approximation of the heads, but in somewhat of a weaker form. Okay. Great. So now, packed with the information about how they do retrieval, about the gather and aggregate, and about the fact that the SSM approximate this mechanism, we ask how hybrid models do, right? They're supposed to have this balance. And they actually do have this balance, right? So hybrid models, for those who are not familiar, are basically models where we have a majority of SSM layers, right? Or recently, there's also been a paper that combines them in the same layer. But let's say you have a majority of SSM layers and a very few attention layers interleaved within the model, right? And when we probe these attention heads, we saw that actually the aggregation operation, right? The aggregate heads, the ones we saw that the SSMs are not that good at, are delegated, are concentrated in the attention layers, right? So basically during optimization, it realizes that it can have a better minima at the landscape if it delegates this aggregation ability to the attention layers, right? And in this way, while attention do this aggregation, SSM can handle language modeling and knowledge extraction, which we saw it does very well, right? And performing similar experiment to what we've done previously, we now mask only the aggregate heads of the attention layers, right? So SSMs left untouched, but only the aggregate heads within the attention parts of the hybrid were gradually masked, right? And first, we can see that, as before, knowledge remains roughly the same. But again, MMLU plummets between 30 to 40%, right? Mathematical reasoning by 90%, right? So just by disabling the gather and aggregate parts, within the attention heads, we could basically reduce the entire model's ability to do retrieval, just because it concentrates its retrieval ability within these layers. Okay. Now, here we sort of we leave the realm of the current paper. I came here, I was invited to present, and I want to give you some sort of a teaser to a paper we're supposed to release soonish, which is it goes the following. So, is there a better way to merge those strands, right? So we did see that hybrid models have this balance where they delegate or concentrate this aggregation, but it's still somewhat heuristic, right? So for example, how would you put, we see that usually these aggregate heads are developed naturally in the middle of the networks. So what if you make a hybrid model that puts attention in the beginning of the network? Will it help? Will it not, right? So it's still kind of vague and heuristic the way these kind of models are, hybrid models are made. So we propose to go the other way around, right? So a bunch of my works deals with distillation. And here the idea is to keep attention only where needed. Okay, what do I mean? So what we do a preliminary step where we go through the entire transformer models and we ablate or zero out, let's say, this attention head, and then we evaluate the entire model's KV score as we've done before, right? And then we put back this head again, nullify this one, and measure the KV retrieval score, right? And what we actually see is that if we sort these heads, right? So basically, the lower the score, right? The lower the score, the more important the head for retrieval. And if we retain all the heads that have actually made the score go very, very much down, right? So we basically retained all the attention heads that actually perform this gather-and-aggregate, right? And the other heads, we transform them to an SSM, right? So only from a certain threshold for a certain importance, we kept an attention head, and the others were turned to SSM versions, right? We get a model that is somewhat with uneven distribution of attention versus SSMs, right? For example, here, let's say all layers are SSM heads because there was no prominent gather-and-aggregate head, or here, let's say two gather-and-aggregates were retained, or here just one, right? And we basically, by doing that, we surgically put the retrieval abilities only where needed, assuming that the gap, as we saw, actually lies within these retrieval abilities. So we just retain surgically retrieval whenever needed, and all other heads are moved to be SSMs, right? So taking this hybrid, very uneven hybrid model, and measuring the retrieval perplexity, we see that the more heads we add, the perplexity gap goes down, right? So we can better match the teacher model. And it saturates kind of quickly, right? So for 30 to 40 attention heads, the return is practically diminishing, right? So just by using about 10 to 20 most prominent gather-and-aggregate heads, we could take down the perplexity gap that back then zoology papers saw and close it, right? Just by using the most prominent gather-and-aggregate heads and basically surgically implementing this retrieval mechanism. And indeed, we first see that the more heads we add, the score of the knowledge-focused benchmarks doesn't change, or even more than that. I think, yeah, SSMs score higher than the teacher right? We saw that they have some sort of an inductive bias towards language modeling in that sense. So it makes sense, right? And it doesn't change, right? So knowledge-focused benchmarks did not change the more attention heads we added, right? Because they don't need this retrievability. But what did change is the retrieval-heavy tasks, right? So first and foremost, the KV retrieval task went from 30% to 99% with the first 10 heads, right? Or SWDE, which we said is manipulation of HTML files. Again, went from 27 to 71% once we surgically implemented and added just a few of these retrieval heads, right? And it's basically confirmed, right? Or if we go back to what we saw at the beginning, that the main bottleneck between these two architecture, right? Between the SSM architecture and the transformer one, is that these very few retrieval heads that bottleneck the retrieval mechanism, right? And what's also interesting that now when we add as little as just 10 attention heads, right? We no longer need the SSM states to act as memories, right? So what happens is we can take the state size of the SSMs dramatically down, and they can still perform these very convoluted tasks that require manipulation within data, right? So basically, previously, we needed a bigger state size to let the Mamba or the SSMs condense as much information as needed, right? But now when we delegated this to the attention that remembers the history, we no longer need this functionality within the SSM parts, right? So I think that's a very interesting corollary, and how it synergizes or it combines with the fact that we have less attention layers is that inference nowadays is mainly bottlenecked by the repeated loading of weights from the memory and memory from the HBM, right? So either it's transformer or SSMs, every step we do generation on, we have to load the entire weights, right? We have to load either the KV cache or the states from the HBM, right? And in that sense, the hybrid model, right, improves that, right? Because for short sequences, when the memory or where the state size is bigger than the KV cache, we have a compact SSM state, right? So we can load it pretty fast. On the other side, because we have fewer attention heads, we have less KV cache instances, right? Just 10 instances, or even more if we tie the weights, right? So what we have here is, even for longer sequences, we have a very, very, very small memory footprint, right? And because inference or generation is bottlenecked by this data movement, it roughly correlates with the running time of the models we can do inference on, right? So by the fact that we surgically or move this retrieval ability, the entire system changed, and we can have much smaller SSM states with substantially less KV cache instances, right? So we've done the third point, and which will conclude, I'd say, the overall talk. And I want to use a few more minutes to discuss what's next. So we asked whether we can promote this kind of specific heads to exhibit Gather-and-Aggregate, right? So right now, basically when we train, it naturally occurs, right? They naturally develop either in SSMs or transformers. And we ask the question whether we can have some sort of a regularization or maybe a condition that could help us choose exactly where we want to pinpoint this head behavior, right? And another thing is that till now we quantified this gather and aggregate mechanism only by doing this k-value retrieval, but we did see that different gather-and-aggregate instances are responsible for different, for example, formats, right? One locks onto the new line, the other one locks onto a different pattern within the data. So we wonder whether there are better ways to detect these heads within the model, because if we detect it better, we can retain the ones that we want in this hybrid manipulation better, right? And I think there are many more open challenges and cool stuff behind that. It actually bridges between the mechanistic interpretability point of view and the actual practical implications for sequence modeling. And yeah, it was work with Eric and Albert, both are my advisors. All experiments are online at the Gather-and-Aggregate repo under the Google Lab. And please contact me, share with me your thoughts about the work or about future directions. And that's it. I'm up for questions. It was rather quick.
Hey, Aviv. Thanks for the talk. It was really great. I'm a big fan of your work. I recently had a paper called Rad Lads that builds upon some of your guys' transformers to SSMs ideas, and we got very good results. But some of the things that I've been trying to get at have been these exact same problems. I think you're concerned with about this gap that is in things like GSM8K and MMLU. And I think one interesting thing that came, so I actually also had a similar result just recently, but I didn't get as far as you did here, where I noticed that the top half matters a lot of these models. Presumably that maps directly to what you found here. I guess one thing I was curious about is if you're familiar with Yoko, you only cache once. They have this setup where, they use the recurrent model on the bottom and then they use attention on the top. I was curious, do you think that's just an exact expression of sort of the same thing that you found, that they essentially accidentally covered those layers with attention?
Yeah, I think so. But I still think that it is, I mean, the idea is very important and cool, and I truly believe that caching once or having one copy of the history, or at least what we saw, we can have up to 10 copies and still have this property is, I would say, the approach. However, it is still, I would say, heuristic, right? The way we throw these attentions or these recurrent models, I would ideally expect we can somehow more mathematically see how we can implement these mechanisms without letting them just, be learned by themselves. Hope it.
Yeah, we have a kind of another interesting thing that Bo Peng just found for RWKV, which I also work on, where he was able to supplement the linear model with a single head on each layer of full attention. He did a little bit of other stuff with it too, but that ended up essentially giving it enough information to do this kind of context retrieval.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it makes sense. And I bet that if you'll actually probe into that model, you'll see that still a big chunk of these attention layers or these attention heads don't need the entire context. Only the ones that implement this some sort of retrieval mechanism need these big guns. But not all of these layers, not all of these heads need this big gun of attention, right? Or this caching of the history. For example, we see that both architectures can do basic feature extraction on the very bottom layers perfectly fine, right? So I would not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever separately, did you ever find that more than one head was useful per layer, or did it always end up being that they were on separate layers?
So we actually, so in that experiment here, which is not out yet, but I can definitely send you the draft we have, is that when we took the 40 most, let's say, or 10 even, 10 most prominent attention heads, they actually perform some sort of a Gaussian distribution. So if you take the layers, right, you'll see that most of the gather-and-aggregate layers heads are concentrated in the middle of the network, and then you can see some sort of, a bell curve with diminishing number of these heads in the bottom and the upper layers.
And then in the fat part of the bell curve, did you see that there were maybe multiple per layer, or is it always sort of at most one? There were multiple. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so that's interesting. Maybe we can engineer it to either learn this dynamically or else to just, supply some kind of like Gaussian distribution of attention across the layers.
Maybe, right? Yeah,
Cool.
that's actually a cool idea. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about the work.
I have a quick question. Apologies if I missed this, but did you look into what like why Mamba layers had a difficult time reproducing this gate and aggregate or gather and aggregate mechanism?
So yeah, it's because the reason is because they have this smoother version of they implement the heads smoothly, so it introduces noise, right? So we had experience when we tried to clean this noise they introduced, and it actually preserved or even took it higher, right? Or like you can see let me go back. For example, here, right? What we actually did here, and this is per layer, but we also had this experiment by just switching a specific head, one head from attention to SSM, which took up the MMLU score, and it's purely because the difference between the head is the noise. That the underlying so the noise is basically a manifestation, as I said, of the cache versus fixed state size of the model.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks. That makes sense.
You can also, whoever wants to ask or talk with me about stuff, can reach me offline if you guys want. No pressure.
I guess I'll ask another question. What do you think about the potential of enlarged state size to replace the spikiness of attention in these layers or in these heads where we need it? Do you have a feeling? I mean, I always kind of think that there's going to be some limitation of that because it can never keep 100% of everything in memory, and it can't know upfront exactly what it has to remember. But do you think we could get, a significant chunk of the way there with just enhanced state sizes?
Yeah, I don't think so. That's why I'm kind of fan of the idea of at least having one cache, right? Maybe more, but at least one cache of the entire history. Because what it seems to me that, the more I use, for example, ChatGPT or these kind of models, the more I see that I throw a bunch, I can throw a huge amount of code, and it only goes larger with the agents or the roles we give them, and they'll eventually have to process such a long context that no fixed size state size could basically handle. So I truly believe that at least one copy of the entire context should be saved. I'm not sure how to maybe randomly access somehow this context, but I do believe that fixing the amount of memory is not the way to go, at least for language modeling and the current problems such as coding or mathematical questions that I see.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. The other kind of interesting thing that your visualization brought up about the gathering portion is that clearly the gathering portion does use only some subset of the original KV cache in terms of the placements that it actually requires. And so there still might be some opportunity for us to find sparsity there.
Right.
Especially because this head is particularly specifically choosing to be sparse. Like it's, that's its job. And so presumably there should be some way for us to figure out in advance or even after it's trained that it doesn't need these other tokens because it's clearly not using them.
Right, exactly. So it is something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm very eager to work on it if any of you guys want to discuss it. So is the fact that we might need to cache the entire history, right? As I said, but we might not need to fetch all the history to the GPU registers, right? Because it's so sparse. Maybe we can have a different way to save these aggregation parts, right? Or this gathering, just so we can, move this data to the GPU only the chunks that we actually need somehow. I'm not sure how, but it would reduce, I believe, the cost of inference largely. So.
Yeah, I think there's some kind of an analysis that we could do on the destinations of those heads, where it's trying to write to, that could allow us to essentially skip those being continuously stored and only store them when it's at an importance point that it knows is something it's trying to store.
Yeah, exactly. These are the exact points I've been thinking of in recent weeks, months.
Cool. Well, hopefully we'll all manage to get it all done through distillation and have incredible, almost linear time models.
Yep. We'll see.
Well, I have a question. First is that I want to know more about how the SSM or attention layer they react different to noise. Like
You have what? Say again?
the SSM layer and the attention layer, how they act when they deal with different noise, not different noise, when they're dealing with noise. Like I remember in one slide you mentioned that I forgot whether SSM or attention layer is more resilient to noise.
So
Do you have more observation on that, or?
yeah, so
Yeah.
I didn't mention it. I mentioned noise in other contexts, but bringing it up, I do know that because, as I mentioned, SSMs replicate themselves, replicate their functionality across several heads. They deal better with noise because they have more of like a backups, right? So they have more instances, they compensate, and as far as I saw, when it comes with some noise within the data, within the distribution, it can handle it better because it spreads its functionality across many heads that somewhat average. Makes sense?
Yes, but for transformer, usually it has some masking mechanism, which would make it be more robust to noise.
Masking mechanism?
Yeah. Do you think
What do you mean masking mechanism?
like you wouldn't when you have a transformer and then there's attention, then they would randomly make masking some of the attention scores. Some of those attention might be
like dropout.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, dropout help these kind of issues. I have actually no idea how dropout in terms of resilience to noise compared to the ability of SSMs to deal with noise.
Okay. Also, for hybrid model, you mentioned that I'm not sure whether you mentioned that. I'm not sure whether I understand this correct. Do you think for SSM layer and attention layer whether they are complementary to each other? And are there any maybe like theoretical clues on that, whether those two are complementary?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, it depends. There are some mathematical equations where you can see these two components as complementary or like as different extreme of the same mechanism or the same equation.
Mhm.
But I'm not certain about it. I mean, as I said it before, like I think you need to catch history, that's for sure. If attending pairwise, interacting with all past attention, with all past context, right, is
Mhm.
the way to go, I'm not sure, right? So I don't know about complementary. I know for sure that most heads don't need, again, not for sure, empirically, right? I know empirically that most heads don't need this big gun of the entire history cache, right? It would
Yeah.
be redundant to give all of them the ability to save the history.
Okay. 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 Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I have several questions. So first off, do you have you ever heard of like the retrieval-guided?
If I have heard of retrieval head
Yeah.
in the context of transformers,
Yeah.
yes. So I do. We mentioned it in the paper. So retrieval heads are basically they score heads by just ablating them. Again, something similar to this thing, right? But the gather-and-aggregate mechanism is it's not different, but in that paper that you mentioned, they just basically score heads and they said that's a head that is related to retrieval. They didn't see that there's actually gather and aggregate, like it's a two-layer mechanism. So you just found heads that, so for example, if we'll go back to this experiment, so the paper you mentioned would see the 22nd and the 24th head is doing the same thing. Both of them hurt retrieval, right? Here we have more intricate understanding of the mechanism and how also, first of all, it's not, so the paper you mentioned talks only about transformers, and here we see how it relates to, like, that it also developed in SSMs and how we can, balance these two.
What's the biggest difference between retrieval head and this aggregate and head?
So the difference is that both heads would be considered retrieval. So it's like it's like a family. The retrieval heads are families that within these there are different functionalities, right? Like different heads that serve different purposes. So it's like a more fine-grained understanding of what's retrieval head and the fact that they also developed in SSMs.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you think like this aggregation head is a more broad concept than the
Yes. Yeah. It doesn't take into account the two-layer interaction we just saw.
Yeah, thank you for explanation. And I think like this retrieval head is both naturally is very useful because like for example, I think like Hugging Face recently has a competition on KV cache compression, and I think like the current winner is the dual attention in which they use the retrieval head, and I think that if you want to prone the KV cache size, and it's better to keep those retrieval head as much as possible. It's
Exactly.
kind of like a similar way.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
We basically take this like background that has been found in Transformer and see how we can use it for the SSM world, right? Where we know we need retrieval mechanism.
Yeah, I have another high level question. So,
Yeah.
do you think like retrieval head itself should be sufficient to bridge the gap between hybrid model and the full attention model?
Yeah. So Let me go here. So we do see that by just taking these retrieval heads, we can recover most of the scores. However, we still see somewhat of this. So for example, GSM8K, right, the mathematical reasoning was completely recovered from 25 to 34, which is llama level, right? But there are some benchmarks like MMLU when we got to 44 instead of 46, right, or lambda, right? So the question here is, so for certain, these retrieval heads bumped, right, the scores. But we believe that these 2 points are actually can be closed by better data or better distillation methods. So if this is indeed the case, so my answer would be yes. I think that these retrieval heads would be are suffice to close the gap. But it's speculation because I don't have, I haven't closed it myself. Like we do have this small gap, which we believe is due to this either data or there's another possibilities. So for example, here, one second. Yeah, for example, here, wait, was it here? Anyway, so I'm not sure if it's that table, but what we did see is that aggregation, even in this kind of model, there's still residues of aggregation in the SSM spots. So I mentioned it in the what's next slide. It might be that the distillation method is perfect and the data is perfect as well, but we don't know how to completely isolate during the optimization the aggregation in the SSM parts and the aggregation in the attention parts, which might still be responsible for this leakage or this gap between the scores. Make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. Thank you for your explanation. And I have a final question. And um, so, um, as far as I know, like this hybrid model or linear recurrent model still have trouble in non-context multi-hop reasoning task. For example, like in the GSM infinite task, this hybrid model can perform very competitive. And do you think there should be some other head like performing this sort of multi-hop reasoning? Yeah.
Other what?
Other head similar to this retrieval or aggregation head.
Oh. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. When we worked on this paper, we asked ourselves, like, for example, there's induction heads, right, that are responsible for in-context learning. So how induction heads comes into play? So we didn't eventually go down this rabbit hole, but we don't know whether these retrieval heads or these gather-and-aggregate heads also account, for example, for in-context learning, right? Or other mechanisms, multi-hop, right, as you mentioned. We had slight experiments and it was actually uncertain. So it might be the case that we need to import other heads that currently are not imported. I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions?
I guess I have one more. So another thing I've been checking a lot is various forms of sparsity, and I was curious if you tried replacing all of the non GNA heads with things like sliding window attention, or if you only tried that using SSMs.
Yeah, I've only tried it using SSMs. I think specifically, I think that sliding window attentions, it's again like what I feel like from looking at the results, they usually, like, you can look at them as an SSM with a different update rule, right? It uses the state differently. It utilizes by having this slide window. And I think it's beneficial for manipulating the data when there is no actual attention mechanism. So as long as you have this attention mechanism, I think it also helps you manipulate the data. So back to your question, I didn't try it, so I didn't actually know. But my hunch is that SSM in the context of the hybrids would perform better. I don't know. I haven't tried to put, instead of SSMs, the sliding window attention.
All right, interesting. Yeah, I know Yoko did try the difference between sliding window attention and RetNet for their bottom layers. It's a little bit of a different setup, but they reported in that paper that sliding window attention was less performant.
Yeah. So it makes sense to me. But it's not empirical. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just interesting from the perspective of
Yeah, sure.
distillation, simply because it's easier to distill to sliding window
Yeah.
attention than it is to
Definitely.
an SSM or to Rokov or GLA
Yep.
or anything.
Yeah. That's a good point. Okay. Songlin, I guess it's up to you when.
Okay, it seems that we do not have further question, and thank you, Avi, for this amazing talk, and also for you very generously sharing a lot of unpublished results in this talk. Yeah, I'm also looking forward to this paper to be archived soon.
Yeah, definitely. It was nice being here. Thank you all for the questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for attending this seminar. I'll stop recording.